My mom texted me one sentence that changed everything. "You're not welcome at our weekly family dinner anymore." No explanation. No argument. Just cut off. So that Friday, instead of going home hurt and embarrassed, I walked into their favorite restaurant, the one they bragged about every week. The owner looked up, smiled, and said, "The usual table, boss." My father choked on his wine. Because the family who banned me had no idea they were about to eat dinner, in a place I now owned, every Friday night, my family gathered for dinner like it was tradition, but it never felt like comfort. It felt like obligation. Like attendance was mandatory, and approval had to be earned before dessert. We sat around the same table, week after week, pretending it was about family, when really it was about control. My mother ran those dinners like a performance. She decided who spoke, who was praised, and who needed advice. My father backed her quietly, nodding along, sipping his drink, letting her words do the work. Conversations weren't conversations, they were evaluations. Who was doing well? Who was slipping? Who needed to be corrected? I learned early on to choose my words carefully. Too much confidence sounded arrogant. Too little sounded lazy. If I talked about my work, it was met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. If my siblings talked about theirs, it turned into long discussions filled with pride and encouragement. The difference was subtle, but it was always there. The house itself felt cold despite the noise. Laughter happened, but it was selective. Jokes were made, but they always seemed to land in my direction. Little comments disguised as humor. "Still doing that thing? Must be nice to have free time." Everyone laughed. I smiled too, because not smiling only made it worse. Leaving those dinners, I usually felt drained instead of full. Like something had been taken from me instead of shared. I'd replay moments in my head on the drive home, wondering what I'd said wrong, what I could have handled better. Somehow, the responsibility always landed on me. And yet, I kept going. Because family is family, right? Because skipping dinner would have caused more drama than enduring it. Because I still believed, somewhere deep down, that if I just showed enough patience, enough success, enough proof, those dinners might one day feel different. I didn't realize then that they weren't meant to change. They weren't about connection at all. They were about reminding everyone where they stood. And week after week, I was quietly being placed at the bottom that I didn't become the problem child because I was reckless or irresponsible. I became the problem because I didn't follow the script my family had already written for me. From a young age, I asked questions they didn't like and made choices they couldn't control. Independence, in our house, was treated like rebellion. My siblings learned quickly what earned praise. Stable jobs. Predictable paths. Opinions that matched my parents'. I learned something different. Every time I expressed an idea that didn't fit neatly into their expectations, it was met with concern instead of curiosity. "That's risky. That's unrealistic. You should be careful." Over time, caution turned into criticism. They liked to remind me how different I was, never in a compliment. At family dinners, my mother would sigh and say things like, "You've always marched to your own beat," as if it were a flaw she tolerated rather than a strength she admired. My father would joke that I'd figure life out the hard way. Everyone laughed. I stayed quiet. Whenever something went wrong, the blame found me easily. If dinner felt tense, it was because I'd said something awkward. If plans changed, it was because I was difficult. I became the easiest explanation for discomfort they didn't want to examine. Labeling me the problem meant they never had to question themselves. What hurt most wasn't the criticism, it was the contrast. When my siblings hesitated, they were supported. When I hesitated, I was warned. When they failed, it was a lesson. When I failed, it was proof. Proof that I should have listened. Proof that they'd been right all along. Eventually, I stopped trying to defend myself. Fighting the label only seemed to strengthen it. So I wore it quietly. The problem child. The one who didn't fit. The one who made family gatherings uncomfortable just by existing. They never asked why I was different. They never considered that my resistance wasn't defiance, but instinct. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I was trying to build a life that didn't require their permission. And for that, they never forgave me. The first time I mentioned the idea, my family didn't even argue with me. They laughed. Not loudly, worse. Soft chuckles, exchanged glances, the kind of reaction that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. My mother tilted her head and asked if this was another phase. My father smiled and suggested I keep it as a hobby. I tried to explain what I was doing. The research. The numbers. The plan. I talked about margins, partnerships, long-term growth. Their eyes glazed over. My brother interrupted to ask if I'd started applying for real jobs yet. Someone changed the subject to weekend plans. The message was clear: this wasn't worth taking seriously. To them, success had one shape. Degrees. Titles. Office buildings with glass walls. What I was building didn't fit into that picture, so they dismissed it before it had a chance to exist. Every update I shared was met with skepticism. Every small win was minimized. Let's see if it lasts. Don't get ahead of yourself. What they never saw was how intentional it all was. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't gambling. I was studying the industry, learning from people who had already succeeded, watching patterns repeat themselves. I knew exactly why this business could work. I just didn't know yet how far it would go. Family dinners became uncomfortable whenever the topic came up. My mother would gently suggest I think about stability. My father warned me not to burn bridges. They spoke as if they were protecting me, but it felt like they were protecting their own expectations. Eventually, I stopped sharing details. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I realized I didn't need their approval to proceed. Every question they asked came loaded with doubt. Every comment chipped away at the excitement I felt. So I went quiet. I built in silence. I let them believe what they wanted, that I was stubborn, unrealistic, chasing something that would fade. What they didn't understand was that while they were laughing, I was laying foundations. And foundations aren't impressive until the structure starts to rise. Once I stopped talking about my plans, everything became easier. No more defending myself. No more explaining decisions to people who had already made up their minds. I worked quietly, early mornings and late nights, turning ideas into steps and steps into progress. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing was happening at all. I met with people my family didn't even know existed. Owners who had built something from nothing. Investors who asked real questions instead of offering warnings. I listened more than I spoke, took notes, learned where others had failed and why. Every conversation sharpened my understanding of what I was building. Money was tight in the beginning. I made sacrifices I never mentioned at family dinners. Skipped vacations. Drove an old car longer than I should have. Reinvested everything instead of rewarding myself. I knew comfort could wait. Momentum couldn't. The risk felt heavy, but it felt honest. There were moments when doubt crept in, usually late at night, when exhaustion made everything louder. I wondered what would happen if my family was right. If this collapsed. If I proved their fears justified. But every time I considered stopping, I remembered how it felt to be dismissed so easily. That feeling pushed me forward when motivation ran out. Slowly, things started to shift. Conversations turned into contracts. Trial runs became steady income. Systems replaced chaos. I didn't celebrate. I documented. I tracked growth, corrected mistakes, and kept moving. Progress wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency is hard to argue with. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce wins. I didn't correct my family's assumptions. Silence became a kind of shield. The less they knew, the safer the work felt. There was freedom in not being watched. By the time my family started making jokes about how long my experiment was taking, I was already negotiating something far bigger than they imagined. Papers were being drafted. Numbers were being finalized. Ownership was shifting quietly, legally, permanently. They thought nothing was happening because nothing was visible to them. But the most important moves I made were the ones no one was invited to witness. And by the time the results became visible, it was already too late to stop them. If there was one place my family agreed on, it was that restaurant. They talked about it like it was an extension of our family, our spot. Every celebration happened there. Birthdays. Promotions. Anniversaries. It was where they felt important, where the staff knew their names and remembered their usual orders. My parents loved telling people about it. They'd recommend it to friends, brag about the atmosphere, the food, the service. My father liked the way the owner always came by the table to shake his hand. My mother liked being recognized, escorted to the good seats. It gave them a sense of status they enjoyed more than they admitted. I'd been there with them dozens of times, sitting quietly, observing. I noticed things they didn't: the rhythm of the staff, the flow of customers, which nights were busiest, which tables turned over fastest. I watched how the owner managed the room, how problems were handled discreetly. To my family, it was just a place to eat. To me, it was a case study. They never asked why I liked it there. They assumed it was just another attachment, another passing interest. When I mentioned how well run it seemed, my mother laughed and said, "Don't get ideas." My sister joked that I couldn't even manage family dinners, let alone a restaurant. Everyone laughed again. What they didn't know was that I'd already been meeting with the owner privately. Not about food. Not about recipes. About numbers. About expansion. About what it took to keep a place like this profitable year after year. Those conversations never made it back to the dinner table. The restaurant became a strange symbol for me. It represented everything my family valued: appearance, recognition, belonging. It was where they felt respected. And without realizing it, they showed me exactly what mattered to them. So when the owner eventually asked if I was still interested in moving forward, I didn't hesitate. I knew what this place meant to my family. And I knew that when the time came, nothing would make the truth clearer than a table they thought belonged to them, suddenly belonging to me instead. That it happened on a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary enough that it took a second to register what I was reading. My phone buzzed while I was in the middle of work. No warning. No lead up. Just a message from my mother that stopped me cold: "You're not welcome at family dinner anymore." I read it 3 times, waiting for a follow-up that never came. No explanation. No argument. Just a decision, delivered like a scheduled change. The casual finality of it hurt more than anger ever could. After years of showing up, staying quiet, absorbing comments, this was how they chose to end it. I stared at the screen, my first instinct being to respond. To ask why. To defend myself. To apologize for something I didn't even understand. Old habits die hard. I could already hear my mother's voice, calm and certain, explaining why this was for the best. For everyone. Then the second message arrived. "We think some distance would be healthy. Please respect that." Healthy. The word sat there, pretending this was about care instead of control. Pretending they weren't cutting me off because I refused to bend anymore. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much. Embarrassment. Rejection. A familiar ache I thought I'd grown used to. Being excluded had always been their sharpest tool, and they knew exactly how to use it. What surprised me most was how quickly the sadness faded. In its place came clarity. No more guessing where I stood. No more hoping they'd finally see me differently. The line had been drawn clearly, in writing. That evening, I imagined them sitting around the table without me, eating, laughing, discussing my absence like it was a necessary correction. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fight my way back in. Because something else had already shifted. If they wanted to remove me from the table so badly, then I would stop trying to earn my seat. And instead, I would decide where, and with whom, I chose to sit next. I knew exactly what my family expected after that text. They expected silence at first, followed by panic. A delayed response, maybe, asking if we could talk. Then an apology. Not for anything specific, just a general one. The kind meant to smooth things over and restore balance. Their balance. They thought I'd show up anyway. That I'd knock on the door Friday night with a nervous smile, pretending nothing had happened. They imagined I'd say I misunderstood the message. Or that I'd ask what I needed to change to be welcome again. That had always been the pattern. Cut me off, wait, then watch me bend. In their minds, this wasn't a rejection, it was leverage. A reminder that access to them came with conditions. That belonging had rules. They believed removing me from dinner would bring me back in line, quieter, easier, more agreeable. I pictured my mother explaining it to relatives. We just needed space. I could hear my father saying it was for my own good. I imagined my siblings nodding along, relieved the tension wouldn't be aimed at them for once. Everyone comfortable again, at my expense. What they didn't consider was the possibility that I wouldn't chase them. That I wouldn't argue. That I wouldn't try to fix it. They'd never seen me choose distance on my own terms. They'd never prepared for that outcome. They mistook my past patience for dependence. My silence for weakness. My presence for need. They thought I came to those dinners because I had nowhere else to be. They were wrong. I didn't need their table to feel whole anymore. I didn't need their approval to move forward. And while they waited for me to react the way I always had, I was already adjusting to a different reality, one where their expectations no longer controlled my next move. They thought cutting me off would bring me back. Instead, it freed me. That I typed a reply more than once. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Every version sounded like I was asking for permission to exist in my own family. I realized then that responding immediately would give them exactly what they wanted, proof that their message had power over me. So I put my phone down. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. For years, I'd reacted on instinct, rushing to smooth things over before they even had to ask. Silence felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. But it also felt honest. For the first time, I wasn't performing for anyone. As the hours passed, no follow-up came. No clarification. No concern. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. And decisions deserve space. Instead of replaying the message over and over, I focused on what was directly in front of me. Meetings. Emails. Contracts waiting for signatures. Life continued, steady and real, outside the emotional bubble my family had always controlled. The contrast was jarring. That night, I sat alone with my thoughts and felt something unexpected, relief. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of tension. No upcoming dinner to brace for. No comments to prepare responses to. No unspoken tests. Just quiet. I thought about how often I'd been told that family was everything. How loyalty meant showing up no matter how uncomfortable it felt. But loyalty, I was learning, wasn't supposed to hurt this much. It wasn't supposed to require shrinking. By choosing not to respond, I wasn't escalating anything. I was stepping out of a cycle I hadn't even realized I was trapped in. I didn't owe them immediate access to my emotions. I didn't owe them reassurance. I owed myself clarity. And clarity came the moment I understood that my silence wasn't weakness, it was a boundary. A calm, deliberate line drawn without anger or explanation. They expected noise. They expected drama. What they got instead was quiet confidence. And that unsettled them more than any argument ever could. Friday came faster than I expected. The day moved slowly, heavy with anticipation, like the air before a storm. I kept busy on purpose, filling every hour with something concrete so my mind wouldn't drift back to that message. By the time evening approached, I felt steady, resolved, even. As the sun began to set, I got dressed without thinking about approval. No rules to follow. No expectations to meet. Just comfort and intention. I looked in the mirror and noticed how different I felt when I wasn't bracing myself for criticism. There was a calmness I hadn't experienced in years. I drove past my parents' house without slowing down. Lights were on. Cars already lined the street. For a brief moment, muscle memory kicked in, urging me to turn the wheel, to show up anyway. I kept driving. The urge passed. Instead, I headed toward the restaurant. The parking lot was full, exactly as it always was on Fridays. Valets moved with practiced ease. Through the windows, I could see familiar faces laughing, glasses raised, conversations flowing. My family would be there. They never missed it. I parked, took a breath, and stepped out. The sound of the city softened as the door closed behind me. Walking toward the entrance, I felt a strange mix of nerves and certainty. Not about what might happen, but about what I already knew. Inside, the host looked up and smiled. Not the polite kind reserved for customers, but the warm recognition of someone who belonged. Before I could speak, he nodded and said my name. That alone made my pulse quicken. As I followed him through the dining room, I caught glimpses of my family's table ahead. Laughter. Familiar gestures. Comfort. They hadn't noticed me yet. And in that moment, standing on the edge of their routine, I realized this wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about presence. About stepping into a space they believed they controlled, and claiming it quietly, without asking permission. Friday night had arrived. And everything was about to change. That I didn't stop at their table. I didn't acknowledge them at first. I just walked past, calm, unhurried, like I belonged there, because I did. My mother noticed me before anyone else. Her laugh cut off mid-sentence, like someone had muted her. My father followed her gaze, confusion flickering across his face. They watched as the host greeted me by name and led me toward the private dining area, the section they always asked about but were never seated in. The room grew quieter behind me. I could feel it without turning around. Curiosity turning into unease. Then the owner stepped out. He smiled when he saw me. Not the forced smile he gave customers, but a genuine one. He shook my hand, clapped me lightly on the shoulder, and asked how things were going. He mentioned upcoming changes, expansion plans, asked my opinion. His voice carried just enough. That's when it hit them. My father's posture stiffened. My sister leaned forward, eyes narrowed. My mother's face lost all color as she tried to piece together what she was witnessing. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was familiarity. Authority. They weren't watching a guest. They were watching someone with ownership. I sat down at my table, menus already waiting. Staff moved around me with ease, attentive in a way that spoke of priority. Across the room, my family sat frozen, trapped inside a moment they couldn't interrupt. No one explained anything to them. No announcement was made. And that silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Because in that quiet realization, they understood something irreversible had changed. The child they had dismissed. The one they excluded. The one they thought needed correction. Had quietly outgrown the space they tried to confine me to. And for the first time in their lives, they were the ones unsure where they stood. No one at my family's table spoke for a long time. I could see it in the stiffness of their shoulders, the way their attention kept drifting toward me and then snapping back to their plates. Conversations restarted, but they sounded forced, like lines being read instead of spoken. I didn't look over again. I didn't need to. The shift had already happened. For years, power at those dinners came from exclusion: who was invited, who was corrected, who was tolerated. That night, the power changed hands without a single argument. Staff checked on me often. Not in a showy way, just enough to signal importance. The owner stopped by again, discussing numbers, timelines, ideas for the space. We spoke quietly, professionally. To anyone watching, it was obvious this wasn't new. Across the room, my father avoided eye contact. My mother's posture was rigid, her expression tight with calculation. She wasn't angry yet, she was recalibrating. Trying to understand where she'd misjudged things. Control slipping always unsettled her more than conflict. What struck me most was how small the moment felt compared to the years that led up to it. No speeches. No revenge. Just reality, visible and undeniable. Everything they'd assumed about me had been wrong, and there was no graceful way for them to pretend otherwise. I realized then that respect isn't something you demand. It's something that arrives when the narrative changes and everyone can see it clearly. That night, the story they'd told themselves for years no longer matched what was happening in front of them. They had used access as leverage. They had decided who belonged at the table. Now, they were sitting at a table that no longer defined anything about me. The power hadn't shifted because I embarrassed them. It shifted because I stopped seeking their validation, and built something real in the space they never thought to look. And once power moves like that, it never goes back quietly. My phone buzzed before I'd even finished dessert. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Timing had always been my mother's favorite tool: strike while emotions were still raw, while certainty was still forming. I let the screen light up and fade without touching it. When I checked later, there were 2 messages. The first was careful. We didn't realize you were involved with the restaurant. The second came minutes after. We should talk. No apology. No acknowledgement of the dinner ban. Just curiosity, dressed up as concern. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to sit with what I felt before engaging on their terms again. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was distance. The kind that comes when you finally see people clearly, without the haze of hope. The next morning, my father called. His voice was softer than usual, almost unfamiliar. He asked how long I'd been doing this, as if it were a phase that needed context. I answered simply. No details. No defensiveness. The more neutral I stayed, the more unsettled he sounded. My mother joined the call halfway through. She tried to laugh it off, said she wished I'd told them sooner. I reminded her gently that I had, once. That conversation ended quickly. Silence filled the space where authority used to sit. They weren't upset about losing me at dinner. They were upset about not knowing. About being the last to realize something important had happened. About no longer having the full picture. And that was the real shift. For the first time, they were reaching toward me not to correct or guide, but to understand where they now stood. The dynamic they'd controlled for years had quietly reversed, and they could feel it slipping further away with every careful word. I didn't deny them a conversation. I just refused to give them control over it. Because access, I'd learned, is no longer something I owe. It's something I choose. For a long time, I believed family was something you endured. That love meant patience without limits, understanding without reciprocity. I thought staying quiet was maturity and swallowing discomfort was loyalty. It took being cut off to see how unbalanced that belief had become. Family, I realized, isn't supposed to make you feel small to stay connected. It isn't supposed to require constant proof of worth. When affection is conditional, when it's offered only if you behave correctly, it stops being love and starts becoming leverage. Watching my parents struggle to adjust after that night made things painfully clear. Their discomfort wasn't about losing me. It was about losing authority. They weren't mourning distance, they were reacting to irrelevance. And that distinction mattered more than anything they could say. I also understood something about myself. I had mistaken tolerance for strength. Real strength was building a life that didn't depend on their validation. One that could stand even if every door they controlled stayed closed. That didn't mean I hated them. It didn't mean I wanted revenge. It meant I finally saw the difference between connection and control. Between family and obligation. Between belonging and performance. The truth was, I hadn't changed overnight. I had always been capable. Always observant. Always willing to work quietly towards something better. They just hadn't been paying attention because I didn't fit their idea of success. And that was okay. I didn't need to rewrite myself to be accepted anymore. I didn't need to explain every decision or justify every boundary. Understanding this didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came with calm. A steady certainty that my worth had never been dependent on their table, their approval, or their rules. I belonged to myself first. And from that place, everything else finally made sense. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message sounded different. Softer. Careful. My mother wrote that they were planning a small family dinner and wanted to know if I'd like to come. No assumptions. No pressure. Just an invitation. I stared at the screen longer than I expected. Not because I was unsure, but because I felt the shift immediately. This wasn't access being granted anymore. It was access being requested. And that changed everything. I thought about all the dinners before. The tension. The quiet judgments disguised as advice. The way I used to prepare myself mentally just to survive an evening. Back then, attending felt mandatory, like proving loyalty through discomfort. This time was different. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't eager either. I realized I could say yes or no without consequences. And that freedom felt more powerful than any apology could have been. When I replied, I kept it simple and honest. I said I'd come, but only if we understood one thing: I wasn't there to be evaluated, corrected, or compared. I wasn't interested in defending my life choices. Boundaries that once felt unthinkable now felt natural. The response came quickly. No pushback. No guilt. Just a short acknowledgement. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. That's when it hit me, how much meaning an invitation can carry. Before, it was a test. A reminder of hierarchy. Now, it was just that, an invitation. Optional. Respectful. If I chose to sit at their table again, it wouldn't be because I needed approval or feared exclusion. It would be because I chose to be there. And choice, I'd learned, is something no one can take from you once you claim it. By the time everything settled, I finally understood something that had taken me years to see. That family table, the one I had fought so hard to stay seated at, was never the source of my worth. It was just a place. A symbol I had given power because I believed belonging had to be earned there. Sitting with them again felt different. Not tense. Not heavy. Just ordinary. Their words didn't cut the way they used to. Their opinions didn't linger in my chest. I realized it wasn't because they had changed dramatically, it was because I had. I no longer needed validation served alongside dinner. I didn't need approval disguised as conversation. Everything they once held over me lost its grip the moment I built a life that stood on its own. Independence had quietly rewritten the rules. For years, I thought exclusion meant failure. That being cut off was proof I wasn't enough. But being banned forced me to step outside their world and see how much bigger mine could be. What felt like rejection became redirection. I didn't succeed to make a point. I didn't build my empire to embarrass anyone. I did it because I trusted myself when no one else did. Because I kept going when silence would have been easier. Because I chose progress over permission. That's when it became clear, the most powerful seat I ever earned wasn't at their table. It was in my own life, at a place I created, surrounded by people who didn't need me to shrink to stay comfortable. If I'm invited now, it's a choice, not a necessity. And if I walk away again someday, I'll do it without fear. Because belonging that depends on control isn't belonging at all. They once thought banning me would remind me of my place. Instead, it showed me something far more important. I never needed their table to know who I was. I just needed to build something strong enough that I could stand, whether they were watching or not.